An analysis of Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. Edgar Allan Poe lived from 1809 to 1849. His father abandoned the family when he was an infant. His mother died when he was 2. He was split from his siblings and taken in by the Allan family, his mother's parents. Mrs. Allan was very nurturing to him. However, Mr. Allan was a tough person and they didn't get along. The Allans were a wealthy family, so he was raised in a wealthy atmosphere, but he was separated from his peers somewhat because he didn't stand to inherit from the Allans. So he was never really viewed as moneyed, even though he lived nicely as a child. At age 18, he was in love with a wealthy young woman, but her parents forced her to break it off because he didn't stand to inherit money. He went to the University of Virginia, and while the Allans paid for his school and expenses, he didn't have spending money like many of his wealthy peers, so he began gambling and got into huge debt. As a result, he was disowned by the Allans. He then joined the Navy. Mrs. Allan sought to get a reconciliation between him and his grandfather, and then they got him into West Point. At that point, however, Mrs. Allan died. He ended up being kicked out of West Point because Mr. Allan would no longer pay his expenses. Edgar then became attached to the Poe family, his father's parents, and his aunt Maria Clem. He went to live with Mrs. Clem and fell in love with her daughter, who was his cousin, named Virginia. At age 26, he married Virginia, when she was only 13 years old. Edgar had some psychological problems, as well as issues with gambling and alcohol, but he was able to provide for his wife while working as a magazine editor. For the 13 years that they were married, his life was relatively stable. But at age 26, Virginia died of tuberculosis. This shattered him. A year after Virginia's death, Poe returned to where he'd grown up and fell back in love with his boyhood sweetheart, who was now a wealthy widow. They were planning to get married, so he returned to Baltimore to fix up some loose ends. But he was later found on a sidewalk bruised and bloody, and died a few days later without regaining consciousness. It was believed that he had become involved in some election fraud scam and was beaten up as a result. He was 40 years old when he died. Common themes in Poe's stories. Poe's main characters almost always suffer from monomania, which is an obsession with one single event or physical characteristic. Many of his stories involve the death or demise of a beautiful young woman. This may be due to important women in his life dying, first his mother and then his wife Virginia. His writing technique. He wrote a very influential essay entitled The Philosophy of Composition, in which he argued that a quality short story should be written so that it can be read in one setting. The author must intend to produce a single effect in the reader, often horror, and he tried to craft his stories so that every word he chose would somehow contribute to that effect. For example, just in choosing a particular sound to a word, he wanted it to somehow add to the aura that he was building. Some say that this is a little bit pompous and not realistic. It might have been Poe simply trying to glorify his abilities a bit too much. Beyond these techniques, he felt that there should be a unified effort in short stories. Therefore, he believed in no subplots that don't connect to the single effect. The goal of writing should be to create beauty. But beauty equals truth. Therefore, beauty must connect to the melancholy. Poe adheres strictly to the elements of plot, exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution. But he liked to keep the resolution very short so that the climax would be still lingering with the reader when they finished the story. All of his short stories are written in first person. Within the discussion board, we're going to talk about why he might have made that choice. The first sentence of the story, The Cask of Amontillado, is aimed at single effect. It reads, "The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge." This immediately reveals the focus of the story's plot. In the second sentence of the story, he addresses the reader. He tends to do this when writing in first person. The same can be seen in many other stories, such as The Telltale Heart. In looking at Poe's use of point of view, we recognize that he employs a first-person point of view. It's likely that he does this because it allows the reader to connect immediately to a specific character. In addition, it allows us to see into the thoughts of the main character. Understanding the character's thoughts is essential to understanding the often twisted psychology of these characters. In the second sentence of the story, we see Poe addressing us as the reader. He says, "You, who so well know the nature of my soul." This was an unusual habit for a writer, but Poe does it in many of his stories. The effect of addressing the reader directly is to engage you. It feels as if you have a person telling us their story in a real-life setting. The phrasing of this sentence also suggests that the reader and the narrator are well acquainted. Poe was very interested in looking at how the human mind works. Nearly all of his stories and poems involve a look at the complex working of a character's mind. Within this story, our main character appears to be a madman. But note the cunning, the plotting nature, and the ability to clearly communicate. He is not out of control, but rather uses his mental capacities for illogical ends. There are numerous types of irony within this story. Dramatic irony is employed within the story. Fortunato is wearing the motley attire of a fool for carnival. The irony is that he is indeed being played for a fool. Note that it is he who insists on going to the narrator's vaults. There's also situational irony. The story takes place in the catacombs of Rome, where people were buried. And indeed, a burial does take place. Lastly, we have verbal irony. We see this at the part of the story where Fortunato asks if Montresor is a mason. Montresor replies by producing his trowel. We as the readers later recognize the purpose of this trowel, but it was lost upon Fortunato at that time.